Hello. This video is about William Paley and the teleological argument. As you might imagine, in this video we're going to consider Paley's teleological argument. This is on pages 38 through 46 from our book, and I posted a PDF of the readings on the course Canvas page. Now, one thing you'll notice is that this reading is longer than our previous few readings, and that's true. Paley goes on a little bit, but I don't think that it is too hard, so just do your best to get through it. So you may be wondering, what's a teleological argument? A teleological argument for the existence of God is an argument that comes from evidence of order in nature. The argument claims to show that following from this order, there must have been a designer that's responsible for it, and of course, this designer is God. So, this argument's also known as the design argument, or sometimes the argument from design. Now I'll begin at the beginning of the reading. In crossing a heath, suppose I pitched my foot against a stone and were asked how the stone came to be there. I might possibly answer that for anything I knew to the contrary, it had lain there forever, nor would it perhaps be very easy to show the absurdity of this answer. So, what's going on in this paragraph? Well, what Paley's doing is saying, imagine, that I'm walking along and I kick a stone. And when I do this, I ask myself, how long has this stone been here? He's pointing out that if I ask myself this question about the stone, it's a perfectly reasonable answer to imagine that the stone has been there forever. Continuing on, Paley says, but suppose I'd found a watch upon the ground, and it should be inquired how the watch happened to be in that place. I should hardly think of the answer which I'd given before, that for anything I knew, the watch might have always been there. So what's going on here? Well, what Paley's pointing out is that if on the same walk where he'd kicked the stone, he'd come across a watch laying on the ground, that this same answer that he gave when asked how long the watch had been here for the stone, it wouldn't work in the case of the watch, right? So if we come across a watch just laying out in the middle of a field and we pick it up and we ask how long has this watch been here, we would never answer that the watch has been there forever, as we would in the case of the stone. And he goes on to ask, why is this? This kind of seems weird. Yet why should not the answer serve for the watch as well as the stone? Why is it not as admissible in the second case as in the first? So this brings up the question, why is the watch not the same as the stone? Why can't I say in both cases that the thing has been there forever? So Paley continues, for this reason, and for not another, that when we come to inspect the watch, we perceive what we could not discover in the stone, that its several parts are framed and put together for a purpose, so that they are so formed and adjusted as to produce motion, and that motion so regulated as to point out the hour of the day, that if the different parts had been differently shaped from what they are, or placed after any other manner or in any other order than that in which they are placed, either no motion at all would have been carried on in this machine, or none which would have answered the use that it now serves by it. Now after this, there's a really long and detailed explanation of the inner workings of a watch, and Paley gets to the conclusion. This mechanism being observed, it requires indeed an examination of the instrument and perhaps some previous knowledge of the subject to perceive and understand it, but being once, as we have said, observed and understood, the inference we think is inevitable, that the watch must have a maker, that there must have existed at some time and at some place or other an artificer or artificers who formed it for the purpose which we find it actually to answer, who comprehend its construction and designed its use. So, what's going on here? Well, we see Paley advancing the conclusion that, look, there couldn't be something like the watch unless there was someone to make it, the watchmaker, right? And he's making the further claim that in the same way as it is with the watch, our whole universe must be like that, right? So in order for the watch to exist, there must be a watchmaker. In order for our universe, our world, everything in it to exist, there must be someone who made that, right? And that someone, of course, is God. From here, Paley goes on to 8 considerations that don't undermine his argument. These are 8 different possible counterarguments, and he goes on to point out why each one won't work. Now you may be wondering, what even is Paley's argument here? So I formulated a couple of different versions that we'll go over. Here's the first one. Premise 1. There are 2 possible explanations for how the world, or a given part of it, for example the human eye, came to be as it is. Either 1, chance, or 2, design. It couldn't be chance, so it has to be design. And that implies a designer. And this designer must be God. Okay, now we're going to pause for a second, and I'm going to ask you what you think of this argument. Okay, now let's wonder how we might object to it. Going back to the argument, notice that how an argument like this works, right, is it's setting up 2 possible ways for how the world could be. There are 2 possible explanations for how the world could come to be as it is, either chance or design. And notice that how the argument proceeds is by saying it couldn't be chance. Now notice what support there is for this premise. The idea is that in the same way that a watch couldn't exist in the middle of a field by chance, the order that we find in the world also couldn't exist by chance. This, anyway, is the claim in why Paley objects the possibility that could be chance, right? So given that there's only 2 choices, we end up where he wants to be, which is to say that it's design. But notice, one way to object to this argument is to imagine that there's more than 2 possible explanations for how the world could come to be as it is, right? So let's imagine that there's 3 possible explanations. There could be chance, there could be design, and then there could be something like evolution. Evolution could be the 3rd option, right? And then notice how the argument has to go on from there. Then the argument would be that there are 3 possible explanations for how the world came to be as it is, right? Chance, design, and evolution. And notice that for the argument to go forward with the conclusion of design, you would need to count out 2 of those 3 other options. So you would need to show that it wasn't chance, which Paley thinks he's done, and then also that in this case it wasn't evolution, leaving only design. So, to go back to our question, how we might object to this argument, One way to do it is to come up with other possible explanations for how the world came to be, right? So I, of course, considered the standard evolution, but it could be any number of other options there. And for each option we add, we have to rule it out in the argument. Now here's a second version of the teleological argument. This one begins, human artifacts are products of design. The universe resembles human artifacts. Therefore, the universe is a product of design. But the universe is complex and gigantic in comparison to human artifacts. So, there probably is a powerful and vastly intelligent designer who created the universe. So, I'm going to pause for a second and ask you what you think about this argument. Do you notice anything about the strength of its conclusion? Looking back, you'll see that it is just probable, right? So, given that the universe is complex and gigantic in comparison to human artifacts, there probably is a powerful and vastly intelligent designer. This version of the teleological argument doesn't give you certainty. So, that would be one way you could object to the argument. You could say, how probable is it, and why might it not be probable? Okay. In summary, in this video, we worked through Paley's teleological argument. I then presented two different versions of the argument, and we had the opportunity to try to think about a few different possible objections. Now, there's all kinds of different objections, and honestly, responses to those objections. But we will consider that in the work for this week.